It began with little changes, things that might not seem like much at first glance. Sarah started working late more often, claiming she had to finish up projects or stay for team meetings. I didn't question it at first. Work gets hectic sometimes, and Sarah had always been dedicated. But gradually, the late nights became more frequent, and her presence at home felt more like an afterthought. When she was home, something was off. She'd sit at the dinner table, her mind clearly elsewhere. Our usual conversations about her day became shorter, filled with vague mentions of work. What stood out, though, was how often she mentioned James, her boss. He seemed to be the center of every story. His ideas, his methods, his knack for inspiring the team. At first, I dismissed it. He sounded like a typical ambitious leader who thrived on being in charge. But then, Sarah's admiration for him started seeping into her thoughts about our life. She began making subtle remarks about roles in relationships, questioning things she'd never questioned before. It wasn't confrontational, just musings about whether she could be better or different. She spoke about how James believed in clear dynamics within relationships, how balance came from everyone knowing their role. These weren't her words, not the way she usually thought or spoke. They felt rehearsed, like she was repeating someone else's philosophy without fully understanding it herself. At first, I told myself it was harmless. Maybe she was just thinking out loud, processing ideas she'd been exposed to. But the more she brought it up, the harder it was to ignore. It wasn't just about work anymore. She'd begun using James's words to reflect on us. There was something disconcerting about the way she talked about control. It crept into our conversations slowly, with her wondering aloud if holding on to control in certain areas might be holding her back. The comments seemed innocent enough, but they didn't feel like they came from her. They came from him. One evening, Sarah came home looking more reflective than usual. She sat down, her movements deliberate, as if her mind was weighing something heavy. Her words mirrored the pattern that had emerged. More talk about how growth comes from stepping out of comfort zones, from letting go of what you think you need. By this point, the unease was unavoidable. These weren't just abstract thoughts. They were tied to something bigger, and I could feel the tension growing, even if I couldn't yet name it. The tension only grew from there. Sarah's fascination with James's ideas began to manifest in more concrete ways. She'd suggest subtle changes to how we handled things at home. Decisions she used to share with me now felt more like declarations. Little things, like rearranging schedules or taking over certain tasks she'd never shown interest in before. At first, I chalked it up to her just trying something new, but it felt oddly out of character. Her conversations about James became more personal, too. It wasn't just about his work philosophies anymore. She'd mentioned things he'd said about life, about people. She seemed drawn to his confidence, the way he framed himself as someone who had all the answers. I started to wonder if there was more to it. The way she spoke about him had a certain glow, as if he could do no wrong. Meanwhile, our own conversations became more strained. When I voiced concerns about the changes I was noticing, Sarah brushed them off with a strained smile, insisting I was reading too much into things. But then came the night that shifted everything. Sarah seemed hesitant as she sat across from me after dinner, her hands clasped tightly around her mug. She took a deep breath, like she was gearing up for something big. She said she had been thinking a lot about James's perspective on relationships. According to her, he believed that trust was built through vulnerability, by letting go of control and accepting new dynamics. She spoke as though it was some profound truth, not an opinion thrown out by her boss. I sat there, trying to process what she was saying. My mind raced as I realized how deeply his ideas had taken root in her. It was as if our marriage, the life we had built together, was being filtered through someone else's lens, one I didn't agree with and hadn't been asked about. What unsettled me most was the way she spoke, almost rehearsed, as though she'd been working up to this conversation for days, maybe weeks. I could tell there was more she wasn't saying, but for the first time, I didn't feel like I knew how to reach her. It wasn't just the ideas she was entertaining. It was the distance they were creating between us. Things started unraveling faster after that night. Sarah seemed different, more withdrawn, but also more firm in her new beliefs. It was subtle, but I could feel her pulling away from me emotionally, inch by inch. Conversations became shorter, our routines felt disconnected, and when we did talk, it always circled back to these ideas James had planted in her mind. She began mentioning trust and boundaries in a way that felt off. At first, I couldn't put my finger on it, but then she dropped the bombshell. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, her voice calm but her words anything but, she said James had suggested something radical. The idea that relationships could grow stronger by introducing new perspectives, even new dynamics. I stared at her, unblinking, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Was she really implying what I thought she was? She insisted it was just a theory, something James had talked about in one of their casual office conversations. But the way she said it, the careful phrasing and the way she avoided my eyes, it felt rehearsed, calculated. You're not suggesting we bring someone else into our marriage, are you? I finally asked, my voice sharp. Sarah's face flushed. It's not about that. It's about exploring ideas, opening up to new possibilities. New possibilities? I repeated, the words tasting bitter. She was quick to reassure me, insisting that nothing had happened, that it was just a concept James had introduced and she was thinking about it. But the fact that she was even considering something like this made my stomach churn. This wasn't the Sarah I knew. I tried to keep calm, to tell myself this was just a passing phase, some misguided fascination with James's philosophies. But her next words made it clear that this wasn't just an abstract idea to her. She admitted that James had been encouraging her to reflect on her role in our relationship and whether she was truly fulfilled. It was as though he'd planted a seed of doubt, and now she was letting it grow unchecked. I sat there in silence, my mind racing. This wasn't just about ideas anymore, it was about trust, about the foundation of our marriage. And right now, that foundation felt like it was crumbling under my feet. That night, sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying Sarah's words over and over in my head. New possibilities. Exploring ideas. It felt like she was testing the waters, gauging how far she could push before I'd react. By the time I got up the next morning, I felt a gnawing unease that wouldn't go away. Sarah was already gone, leaving a note on the counter about a work meeting. Her handwriting, usually so neat and bubbly, looked rushed, almost tense. I stared at it for a long moment before crumpling it in my hand. Over the next few days, I tried to act normal, to pretend I wasn't bothered. But I was. Every conversation felt like I was navigating a minefield, afraid that one wrong move would bring up James's name or another one of his ideas. And yet, I couldn't avoid the subject entirely. One evening, I brought it up, trying to keep my tone steady. Sarah, you've been talking about James's ideas a lot lately. Do you think he's crossing any boundaries with you? She froze for a moment, her fork pausing midway to her plate. What do you mean? I said carefully, he seems to have a lot to say about relationships. Does he talk about this stuff with everyone at work, or is it just you? Her lips pressed into a thin line. James is just trying to help. He's been through a lot in his own relationships, and he shares his perspective. That's all. Do you think it's appropriate? I pressed, feeling my frustration rising. She bristled at the question, her shoulders tensing. He's my boss. He's allowed to share his thoughts. It's not like I'm doing anything wrong. That was the first outright defensiveness I'd seen from her, and it only made me more suspicious. Something about the way she said it, the way her voice caught at the end, told me there was more she wasn't saying. I let it go for the moment, but my gut told me I needed to know more. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Sarah left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, a message lighting up the screen. It was from James. Dinner tomorrow night? We can talk more about what we discussed. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the notification. I didn't open the phone, I wasn't even sure if I wanted to, but my heart raced as a dozen scenarios played out in my head. What had they discussed? Why was he inviting her to dinner? When Sarah came back into the room, I acted like I hadn't seen anything, but the tension was unbearable. The gap between us, the one James seemed determined to widen, felt wider than ever. That night, I realized I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Whatever this was, it was bigger than just her fascination with a boss. It was tearing us apart, and I wasn't sure we'd survive it. The following day, I couldn't focus on anything. My mind kept drifting back to that message. Dinner? What could they possibly need to discuss over dinner? The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I needed answers. When Sarah came home that evening, she was in an unusually cheerful mood, humming softly as she placed her bag on the counter. I watched her closely, trying to gauge whether she was hiding something. "How was work?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Busy," she replied with a quick smile. "James had some good ideas for restructuring a campaign we've been working on. It's been a lot of back and forth, but I think we're making progress." "James seems to be a big influence on you lately," I said, testing the waters. She gave a slight shrug, pouring herself a glass of water. "He's good at what he does. I'm just learning from him." It was the kind of answer that sounded reasonable on the surface, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was deflecting. The next evening, Sarah got home later than usual. When she walked through the door, I immediately noticed her hair was neatly styled, her makeup just a little more polished than normal. She dropped her keys on the counter and gave me a quick smile, though her eyes darted away from mine. "Late night?" I asked, doing my best to sound neutral. "Yeah, sorry," she said, slipping off her heels. "We had a client dinner. James wanted the whole team there to discuss the next phase of the project." I nodded slowly, trying to read between the lines. She didn't smell like alcohol or perfume, but something about her energy felt off. She was cheerful, almost too much so, like someone who was overcompensating. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me. While Sarah was in the shower, I opened her laptop under the pretense of checking something for work. Her email was already open. At first, it looked like the usual back and forth about deadlines and marketing pitches, but then I saw a message chain from James. His tone was casual, but there was something overly familiar about the way he addressed her. No professional formality, just her first name and a smiley face. In one of his responses, he wrote, "Last night was great. It's refreshing to talk to someone who gets it. Let's keep the momentum going." My stomach sank. The words weren't explicitly damning, but they carried a weight that made my skin crawl. What kind of momentum were they talking about? I closed the laptop before Sarah came out of the shower, but my mind raced all day. I was no longer just suspicious. I felt certain that James was crossing lines. The question was whether Sarah was letting him. That evening, I decided to confront her. When she came into the living room, I didn't waste time. "What exactly is going on between you and James?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. She froze mid-step, her expression caught between surprise and irritation. "What do you mean?" I said slowly, "he doesn't seem like just your boss anymore." Her face flushed, and for a moment, she looked genuinely caught off guard. But then, her defensiveness kicked in. "You're being ridiculous. He's my boss, and that's it. Whatever you're imagining, it's not true." But her words didn't match the tension in her voice, and I wasn't convinced. Whatever was happening, this wasn't just work anymore. Sarah's defensiveness only deepened my suspicions. The way she avoided eye contact, the edge in her tone, it all screamed guilt. But I wasn't ready to accuse her outright, not without more proof. "Then explain the late nights," I said calmly. "And the message I saw about dinner. Why is James texting you about keeping momentum? That doesn't sound like just work to me." Her face stiffened, and she crossed her arms. "You went through my messages?" "I saw the notification on your phone," I lied, unwilling to admit I had checked her laptop. "I didn't have to dig for it. It was right there." She exhaled sharply, her shoulders dropping as if she were bracing herself. "James is just passionate about his work. He likes to make sure everyone's on the same page. The dinner was a team thing. You're blowing this out of proportion." Her explanation sounded rehearsed, and it didn't address the casual familiarity between them. Still, I let it go for the moment, unwilling to push her into shutting down entirely. But that night, as we lay in bed, the distance between us felt unbearable. I could hear her breathing beside me, steady and calm, like she had nothing to worry about. Meanwhile, my mind was spinning. If she wasn't hiding something, why was she so defensive? And why did James have so much influence over her? The following week, things came to a head. Sarah announced she'd be going out after work for another team dinner. She said it casually, almost as if daring me to question her. I didn't say much at the time, but I decided I couldn't just sit back anymore. When she left that evening, I waited an hour before grabbing my coat and heading out. I didn't have a specific plan, just a gnawing feeling that I needed to know what was really going on. I drove to her office building, parking a block away where I could watch without being seen. Sure enough, about 20 minutes later, I saw her leaving with James. They weren't walking with the rest of the team, just the two of them. She was smiling, her head tilted slightly toward him, while he gestured animatedly. It wasn't outright inappropriate, but there was an ease between them that didn't sit right with me. I followed them at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter with each turn. They pulled into the parking lot of a small upscale restaurant, one I knew well. It wasn't the kind of place you'd take a group of coworkers. It was intimate, meant for long conversations and good wine. As I sat in the car, watching them disappear inside, my stomach churned. This wasn't just a team dinner. This was personal. When Sarah came home later that night, I didn't confront her right away. I needed to think, to figure out how to approach this without letting my anger take over. But as I watched her set down her purse and casually slip off her shoes, I couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on. How long had she been letting James chip away at the boundaries of our marriage? The following morning, I couldn't hold back anymore. As Sarah moved around the kitchen, making her usual coffee, I leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. She looked so at ease, humming softly under her breath like nothing was wrong. "I went by your office last night," I said, keeping my tone as steady as I could. Her hand froze mid-reach for the sugar jar. "What?" "I was near your office," I repeated, "and I saw you and James leaving together. Just the two of you. Care to explain that team dinner?" Her face paled, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. But then her expression hardened. "Are you spying on me now?" "It's not spying when I'm trying to figure out why my wife is spending so much time with another man," I snapped, the frustration finally bubbling to the surface. She placed the sugar down slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You're being ridiculous." James wanted to discuss some things privately before the rest of the team arrived. It wasn't just the two of us the whole night. I folded my arms, staring her down. "You were at Harrington's, Sarah. That's not exactly a group dinner kind of place. Do you really expect me to believe this is all work-related?" Her eyes darted away, and she sighed heavily. "I can't help what you want to think. I told you the truth. If you're going to twist it into something it's not, that's on you." Her words were sharp, defensive, but there was no conviction behind them. She wasn't denying what I'd seen, she was deflecting. And that only confirmed what I already suspected. For the rest of the day, the tension was unbearable. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was clipped and distant. She busied herself with errands while I tried to focus on work, though my mind refused to cooperate. Every time I replayed the conversation in my head, her tone, her body language, all of it felt like an elaborate dance to avoid the truth. That night, after the kids were asleep, Sarah sat across from me in the living room. Her expression was tight, her hands clasped in her lap. "I don't know what you want me to say," she began, her voice low but firm. "James is my boss. We talk about work. That's it. I shouldn't have to explain myself every time I come home late." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "Then why does it feel like you're hiding something? Why does he seem to have so much influence over you, Sarah? You've been distant for weeks, and every time I ask about it, you shut me down. You don't talk to me anymore, you talk to him." Her eyes flickered with something. Guilt, maybe, or frustration. "You're imagining things," she said, but her voice wavered slightly. "James has been supportive, that's all. He's helped me think about things differently, about what I want, who I am." I stared at her, feeling like the ground beneath me was shifting again. "And what does that mean for us?" She hesitated, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I don't know yet." Those words hit me like a punch to the gut. Not because they were loud or angry, but because they were honest. She didn't know. And for the first time, I realized how deep James's influence had gone. The words hung between us, heavy and cold. "I don't know yet," she had said, leaving me in a silence that felt more final than anything else she could have said. I didn't press her right then. I couldn't. Instead, I let her walk away, retreating upstairs as though she hadn't just driven a wedge deeper into the space between us. I stayed in the living room long after she left, trying to sort through the mess of emotions swirling inside me. There was anger, sure, but underneath that was something heavier. Doubt. Fear. The realization that I was losing her, and I didn't know if there was any way to stop it. Over the next few days, we barely spoke. When we did, it was surface level, the kind of small talk you'd exchange with a neighbor, not a spouse. I'd ask how her day was. She'd say fine. She'd ask if I needed anything from the store. I'd say no. Meanwhile, the elephant in the room, the shadow James cast over everything, grew larger and darker. Then, one evening, Sarah came home later than usual. She didn't look at me as she walked in, her heels clicking softly against the floor. "Long day," she muttered, dropping her bag by the door. I didn't respond. Instead, I watched as she moved about the room, avoiding my gaze. She seemed restless, her movements too quick, too deliberate. Finally, she sat down, letting out a long sigh. "We need to talk," she said, her voice careful, as though she were stepping onto thin ice. I stayed where I was, leaning back in my chair. "About what?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "James and we had a conversation about relationships. About how couples can grow by challenging themselves." Her words felt rehearsed, deliberate. My chest tightened. "What exactly does that mean?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. She looked at me then, her expression hard to read. "He thinks that sometimes we hold ourselves back, that we get stuck in patterns that stop us from reaching our full potential. And maybe he has a point." For a moment, I couldn't speak. My mind was racing, trying to keep up with what she was saying, and what she wasn't. "Are you saying," I began slowly, "that he's suggesting we change something in our marriage?" She didn't answer right away, and that silence was more damning than anything she could have said. "Sarah," I said firmly, leaning forward now, "you need to be honest with me. What exactly is James telling you? And why are you listening to him more than your own husband?" Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, she looked defensive. "It's not about listening to him," she snapped. "It's about exploring ideas, figuring out what works for us. That's all." "That's all," I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "Sarah, you're letting this man, this boss, redefine how you see our marriage. Don't you see how messed up that is?" She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "I don't expect you to understand," she said, her tone clipped. "But maybe I need to figure this out on my own." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and before I could respond, she turned and walked out of the room. That night, as I sat alone in the dark, I realized something I'd been avoiding for weeks. Sarah wasn't just distant. She was questioning everything we'd built, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if she'd choose to stay. The days that followed were a blur of tension and silence. Sarah and I moved through the house like strangers, our conversations reduced to logistics. What time the kids needed to be picked up, whether the bills had been paid. But beneath the surface, the weight of what she'd said lingered. I kept turning her words over in my head. Maybe I need to figure this out on my own. It felt like a decision had already been made, even if she hadn't said it outright. Then, one evening, Sarah came home later than usual again. This time, there was no explanation, no hurried excuse about meetings or deadlines. She just walked in, set her bag down, and avoided my gaze as she headed upstairs. Something inside me snapped. I waited until she came back down, wearing her usual neutral expression, and stood in her path. "We need to talk," I said firmly. Her shoulders tensed, but she nodded and gestured for me to sit. For once, she didn't seem defensive, just tired. "Where were you tonight?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "At work," she replied, but her tone lacked conviction. "All night?" I pressed. Her eyes flickered, and I saw the hesitation. "James asked me to stay late to go over some things for an upcoming campaign." There it was again, his name. James. Always James. I leaned forward, my hands clasped tightly in front of me. "Sarah, you're spending more time with him than you are with me. Don't you see how that looks? How that feels?" She sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Mark, it's not what you think. James is just someone I can talk to right now. Someone who understands." "Understands what?" I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. What is he giving you that you think you can't get from me? She didn't answer right away, and the silence was deafening. Finally, she said, "It's not about what he's giving me. It's about what I'm realizing I need for myself." I felt the anger bubbling up, but I forced it down, trying to stay calm. "And where does that leave us? Where does that leave this marriage?" Her gaze dropped to her hands. "I don't know," she admitted softly. "I'm trying to figure that out." For a moment, I didn't speak. The room felt colder somehow, the air heavy with unspoken truths. Finally, I stood, my heart pounding. "I've heard enough," I said, my voice low. "You don't get to string me along while you figure things out. Either you're in this marriage, or you're not." She looked up at me then, her eyes wide, almost pleading. But she didn't say anything, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her sitting there, alone. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew things had reached a breaking point. Sarah had been drifting for weeks, but now it felt like she was slipping through my fingers entirely. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I could stop her. The morning after that conversation, the house felt quieter than usual. Sarah left early, barely saying a word, and I didn't stop her. I had nothing left to say, not after her vague admission the night before. She was trying to figure herself out, but in the process, the kids, thankfully, seemed unaware of the growing tension. I focused on them, trying to keep everything as normal as possible while my mind churned over the situation. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was losing her a little more each day. That evening, Sarah came home on time for once. I watched as she moved around the kitchen, preparing dinner like nothing had happened. But her silence was louder than words. When we finally sat down to eat, she broke it. "Mark," she said, her voice measured, "I think we need to take some time apart." I froze, my fork hovering mid-air. "What do you mean?" She placed her hands flat on the table, her gaze steady. "I need space to think, to figure out what I want. This isn't about you. It's about me." "Not about me?" I said bitterly. "Sarah, this is our marriage. You don't just get to press pause while you sort out your feelings." Her expression tightened. "I'm not pressing pause. I'm trying to make sure I'm being honest, with myself and with you." I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and disbelief. "And James? Does he fit into this little self-discovery plan of yours?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't rise to the bait. "This has nothing to do with James. It's about me." But I didn't believe her. Not anymore. The rest of the meal was silent. After the kids were in bed, Sarah started packing a small bag. She said she'd stay with her sister for a while, give us both some space. I didn't argue. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted her to stay. When she left, the house felt emptier than it should have. I sat in the living room, staring at the spot where she'd kissed the kids goodbye, and wondered how it had come to this. Later that night, my phone buzzed. It was a text, from James. "I hope you understand this is what's best for Sarah right now. She's finding clarity." I stared at the screen, my blood boiling. Clarity? Who was he to tell me what was best for my wife, for my family? I didn't reply. Instead, I deleted the message and threw my phone onto the couch, my jaw clenched. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. James had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Sarah's absence hit harder than I expected. The first night alone, the silence of the house felt unbearable. I tucked the kids in, sat in the living room with the TV on low, but my thoughts kept circling back to that text from James. "She's finding clarity." The arrogance of it burned in my chest. It wasn't just a casual comment, it was a claim. A reminder that he was there, whispering in Sarah's ear, framing her choices as enlightened, while I sat here picking up the pieces. The next day, I decided I couldn't let it slide. I needed answers, needed to understand how deep this went. So I made a decision. I drove to Sarah's sister's house, where I knew she was staying. When I arrived, Sarah's car was parked in the driveway. I hesitated for a moment, then knocked on the door. Her sister opened it, her expression immediately wary. "She's inside," she said, stepping aside reluctantly. I found Sarah in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the couch with a mug in her hands. She looked surprised to see me but didn't say anything at first. "We need to talk," I said, standing stiffly near the doorway. She set her mug down and nodded slowly. "Okay." I didn't bother sitting. "When did James start having this much influence over you?" Her eyes widened slightly, but she didn't deny it. "Mark, this isn't about him." "Don't," I interrupted sharply. "Don't tell me this isn't about him. I saw the text he sent me. He thinks he knows what's best for you? For us." She looked away, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "James is just helping me think through things." "That's it. Helping you think through things?" I repeated bitterly. "Do you even hear yourself, Sarah? He's manipulating you, filling your head with ideas that are tearing our family apart." Her jaw tightened, and she finally looked up at me. "I'm not a child, Mark. I can make my own decisions." "Then make one," I said, my voice rising. "Decide whether you want to be in this marriage or not, because I'm done waiting for you to figure it out." She flinched at my tone, but there was no regret in her eyes, only defiance. "I told you I need time, and I'm telling you I won't wait forever," I said coldly. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was unbearable, and I could feel her sister hovering just out of sight in the hallway. Finally, Sarah stood, wrapping her arms around herself. "I didn't want it to get to this point," she said quietly. "But maybe some distance is what we need." "Distance?" I echoed, shaking my head. "You're choosing distance over fixing what we have?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, leaving me standing there, alone in the room. When I walked out of the house, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily on my chest. Sarah wasn't coming back. Not yet, maybe not ever. And for the first time, I started to think about what my life would look like without her in it. The drive home felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life fall apart from a distance. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and the same thought looped through my head: she's not coming back. When I got home, the kids were still at school, so the house was quiet. Too quiet. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. James's text haunted me, and the anger bubbling under my skin was impossible to ignore. I opened his message again, rereading every smug word. This wasn't just about Sarah anymore. He was inserting himself into our marriage, claiming authority over a relationship he had no business in. I didn't know what his endgame was, but I wasn't about to let him win. Before I could stop myself, I typed out a reply. "Stay out of my marriage. Whatever you think you're helping with, you're not." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. It felt impulsive, but I didn't care. If James thought he could worm his way into Sarah's life without consequences, he needed to think again. I hit send and waited. The reply came faster than I expected. "I'm only supporting Sarah as a friend. Maybe you should focus on why she felt the need to reach out to someone else in the first place." My grip tightened on the phone. I could almost hear his smug tone through the text, the implication that this was somehow my fault. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but instead, I tossed it onto the table and stood up, pacing the kitchen. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I picked up the kids, made dinner, went through the motions of normalcy while my mind raced. Every time I looked at my phone, I half expected another message from James, but none came. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat in the living room, the house dark and still. My thoughts were relentless. The anger I felt wasn't just at James, it was at Sarah, too. At how easily she'd let this man worm his way into her mind. How little she seemed to care about what it was doing to us. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Sarah. She answered on the third ring, her voice cautious. "Mark, I saw what James texted me," I said without preamble. There was a pause, and then she sighed. "Mark, I told you he's just trying to help." "Help? By blaming me for this mess." I snapped. "Do you even see what he's doing, Sarah? He's driving a wedge between us, and you're letting him." Her voice sharpened. "I'm not letting him do anything. This is my decision, Mark. Stop acting like I can't think for myself. Can you?" I shot back. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like James is the one making all the decisions for you." The line went quiet for a moment. When she finally spoke, Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "I'm not having this conversation right now. Good night, Mark." And just like that, she hung up. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the weight of her dismissal pressing down on me. I realized then that I couldn't fix this. Not on my own. Sarah had made her choice, even if she wouldn't say it out loud. And for the first time, I started to think about what I needed to do for myself, not for her. The next morning, I woke with a heaviness that I couldn't shake. The anger from the previous night had dulled, leaving behind a cold determination. Sarah might have made her choice, but James's influence was still there, looming over everything like a dark shadow. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That afternoon, without telling anyone, I drove to her office. The receptionist hesitated when I asked to see James, her uncertainty evident in the way she glanced toward the phone before calling up to his office. Moments later, she directed me to the elevator. The ride felt agonizingly slow, each floor marked by a quiet ding that seemed louder in the silence of my thoughts. By the time the doors opened, I was ready for whatever was about to happen. James's office was polished and modern, with sharp lines and minimalist decor. He stood when I entered, a faint practiced smile on his face that made my skin crawl. He didn't seem surprised to see me, which only fueled the frustration already boiling under the surface. I didn't bother sitting when he gestured toward a chair. Instead, I stood firm, stating my piece directly. I told him his influence over Sarah had gone far enough, that he was crossing lines he had no right to cross, manipulating her under the guise of support. James's calm demeanor shifted slightly as I spoke, though he tried to mask it with measured responses. He insisted that Sarah had come to him willingly, seeking guidance, and that she was making her own choices. He suggested that if there were issues between us, perhaps I should reflect on why Sarah felt the need to look elsewhere for understanding. His words felt like a calculated jab, and they landed with precision. For a brief moment, I felt the sting of doubt he wanted me to feel, but I pushed it aside. I reminded him that our marriage was none of his business, that whatever relationship he thought he had with Sarah was inappropriate and harmful. The conversation ended tensely, with James maintaining an air of superiority while I walked out, feeling as though I'd been speaking to a brick wall. Confronting him hadn't resolved anything. If anything, it reinforced the reality that his hold over Sarah wasn't just professional, it was personal. Driving home, the weight of the situation pressed harder against me. James hadn't backed down, and Sarah wasn't here to defend herself, or our marriage. As I parked the car, I sat for a moment, staring at the quiet street outside the house, trying to figure out what came next. The answers weren't clear. What was clear, though, was that I was standing on the edge of something irreversible. The days after confronting James passed in a haze. Nothing about that meeting had gone the way I'd hoped. Instead of gaining clarity or forcing him to back off, I'd left his office feeling more powerless than ever. His calm dismissal and smug confidence only confirmed how deep his involvement had become. At home, things were no better. Sarah was still at her sister's house, and the emptiness in the house felt heavier with each passing day. I kept busy with the kids, focusing on their routines and trying to shield them from the growing cracks in our family. But every quiet moment brought me back to the same questions. How had things gotten this far? Could they ever be repaired? Sarah's absence wasn't just physical. She texted occasionally, mostly about practical matters like the kids or the house, but there was no warmth, no sign of the woman I had known for years. The woman who used to share everything with me now felt like a stranger, her words distant and formal. One evening, as I was sorting through mail at the kitchen table, I came across an envelope addressed to Sarah. The sender's name caught my eye. It was from a personal coaching service. My chest tightened as I read the details. It was one of those programs meant to help people rediscover themselves and unlock their potential. It had James written all over it. The confirmation email attached mentioned several sessions already scheduled, most of which lined up perfectly with the night Sarah had come home late. Suddenly, her vague excuses about staying late for work felt like lies that had been far too easy for her to tell. I set the letter down, my hands trembling slightly. It wasn't just about Sarah needing space or time to think. She'd been planning this for weeks, maybe longer. While I'd been trying to hold everything together, she'd been stepping further and further away, laying the groundwork for a life that didn't include me. That night, I didn't sleep much. The realization that Sarah had been keeping so much from me felt like a weight I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the betrayal of her actions, it was the deliberate nature of it all. The secrecy, the calculated distance. It was clear now that James wasn't just an influence in her life. He was a catalyst for everything falling apart. When morning came, I knew I couldn't keep waiting for her to come to her senses. The time for waiting, for hoping, was over. It was time to take action, not to save the marriage, but to protect what mattered most, myself and the kids. The next day, I called a lawyer. It wasn't a decision I made lightly, but the events of the past few weeks had left me with no choice. Sarah had made her priorities clear, and waiting around for her to decide if she wanted to stay married wasn't an option anymore. The lawyer was direct but understanding. We discussed the situation in detail, the time apart, her growing attachment to James, and the coaching program that seemed designed to pull her even further away. I wanted to protect myself and the kids, to ensure that no matter what happened next, their lives would remain as stable as possible. Filing for divorce felt like admitting defeat, but it also felt like reclaiming a part of myself. Sarah had been making decisions for weeks, maybe months, without consulting me or considering what those choices meant for our family. It was time for me to take control. When I told Sarah later that day, her reaction was exactly what I expected. She was calm at first, then defensive, claiming I was overreacting, that we could still work things out. "We just need more time," she insisted, her voice pleading. But I stood firm. "Time isn't going to fix this," I said. "Not when you've been keeping secrets and letting someone else dictate how you see our marriage." She tried to deny it, but her arguments felt hollow. For the first time, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. The weeks that followed were tense but straightforward. Sarah stayed at her sister's house while we worked out the details of custody and dividing assets. It wasn't easy, but I stayed focused on the kids, making sure they felt safe and loved despite the upheaval. Eventually, the day came when the papers were signed, and it was official. When Sarah and I exchanged our final goodbyes, there was no warmth, no lingering affection, just the quiet acknowledgement of something that had run its course. In the months that followed, I found myself feeling lighter. The pain of losing Sarah was still there, but it was muted, dulled by the realization that our marriage had been broken long before it ended. For the first time in a long time, I felt free to focus on the kids, on rebuilding my life, on finding a version of happiness that wasn't tied to someone who no longer valued what we had. James? He faded into the background almost as quickly as he had appeared. Whatever role he played in Sarah's life after the divorce didn't matter to me anymore. I'd spent enough time fighting for someone who had already let me go. Now, when I look back on it all, I don't feel bitterness. Just clarity. The kind Sarah claimed she was searching for but never found.